Carol, thank you so much for having me tonight and for the introduction and arranging the conversation afterwards. And I want to thank everybody for being here. It's really wonderful to be able tonight to share some of the stories and insights from my new book. So in the Invention of Public Space, I look at a series of experiments in open space in New York City in the 1960s and 70s that sought to reaffirm the value and possibility of city life in a moment of urban crisis. And a lot of the projects I write about actually don't exist anymore. And indeed, many were written off or abandoned at the conclusion of the period I look at and have largely languished in obscurity. But I argue they're at the origins of ways that we think about urban space that endure to this day for better and worse. So even though the time period and the location and the projects that I write about are quite narrow in scope, these very particular stories, I think, help to illuminate some of the bigger and more vexed questions around the relationship between democracy, design, and urban space that continue with us today. And there we go. Okay. And I'm just going to jump in and sort of start this story in media res with an image that tells a very great part of the story of the book. So the image that we're all looking at is taken in 1967. It's sometime after March, and we're at a meeting in the storefront space of a community organization on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. And I'm going to go ahead and make some introductions. Standing on the left, you have August Heckscher, who's New York City's brand new Parks Commissioner. He's here to carry out one of a slew of new high-profile projects that his predecessor in the role, Thomas Hoving, initiated during his very short tenure as Parks Commissioner. And Heckscher, who's Augie to his friends, shares his name with his grandfather, a New York philanthropist who made his fortune in mining. He studied the younger Augie at St. Paul's and Yale and Harvard and was an arts consultant to the Kennedy administration. And so in the picture, you can't hear his patrician accent, but you can see his bow tie and his three-piece suit and maybe notice the slightest bit of discomfort in these popular surroundings. And standing next to him is Courtney Callender. In 1966, he was appointed the Parks Department's first ever community relations officer. And in fact, he's also the city's first African-American parks official ever. Callender will go on to head the city's Department of Cultural Affairs in just a few years. After this photo is taken, he'll also become the director of the Studio Museum and lead other cultural institutions in the city. But right now, he's standing here holding a vest pocket park, or at least he's holding a model of a vest pocket park that's going to be built in a vacant lot nearby. It's one of 10 very small parks, and that's where this antiquated vest pocket nomenclature comes from, that the Parks Department is planning as part of an experimental program. The big idea behind it is that there could be one of these on every block as part of a citywide open space network. Callender's job is to institute community participation for parks planning and programs. And this is a brand new job for a brand new task. In 1964, the Federal Office of Economic Opportunity had mandated maximum feasible participation by affected communities in its programs, but no one knows what that means exactly. Next to Callender, the woman standing up next to him and the men and women and children seated in this space are what we would call the community. The historical sources I worked with don't preserve their names, but we have members here of the neighborhood group Movimiento Puertorriqueños Unidos, which was started by a local tenement super, was involved in the city rent strikes in 1964, and is one of hundreds of groups that wrote to the Parks Department asking them to consider a vacant lot in their neighborhood for a vest pocket park when this new program was announced. And here's the vacant lot. It's on East 5th Street between Avenue C and D, and it's narrow and deep and surrounded by tenements with the same footprint. Just like in other neighborhoods where this Vest Pocket Park program is focused, these vacant lots are one physical manifestation of the major social and spatial restructuring of the city in this period. So we sort of know this, but it's helpful to be reminded. Between 1960 and 1970, more than 1 million Black and Puerto Rican people took up residence in New York City, and 1 million non-Hispanic whites left. And between 1940 and 1970, the city went from accounting for almost 2/3 to less than half the total population of the metropolitan region. So what that looks like in the inner city when white residents leave and are replaced by people of color looking for better housing is landlords neglect their buildings. The city isn't spending money on code enforcement or rehabilitation, not to mention services like trash collection, and you start to see abandonment and arson. And ironically, simultaneous conditions of vacancy and density. So the buildings that are occupied are overcrowded, and there's not enough open space. So the vacant lots that were buildings and that inevitably fill up with trash and rats aren't just eyesores. They're tempting and dangerous for children to play in, and they're a highly visible symbol of neglect by the city. This one that we're looking at in East Harlem was photographed by the photographer Bruce Davidson in 1968. And that's the year that the Kerner Commission was tasked with investigating the riots erupting in US cities in the period that actually started in New York in 1964 after police shot and killed James Powell, a 15-year-old Black teenager, basically because he was hanging out in the wrong neighborhood. Now, the commission is vice chaired by New York City's mayor at the time. And in its report, it puts the state of cities' open space quite high on the list of factors contributing to the disturbances they're investigating, and which they identify as reactions to a racist society and the abysmal living conditions in urban ghettos. And they also write that parks and playgrounds, as an immediately visible aspect of the public scene, are also sort of high up on their list of causes. When they're neglected, it's, quote, a slap in the face to the local resident. And the commission in the report also notes that these kinds of spaces can be improved a lot faster and a lot more visibly than making changes to housing or to education or to the welfare system. So in this context for the city, small parks like this one are an opportunity to show that it's doing something about that neglect. And they're also an opportunity to experiment in more direct forms of democracy. The city's vision of these small parks is that they're going to be an interface between the city and the people, a site to forge a direct relationship between city government and the communities most alienated from it. So the project responds to demands for decentralization, which is defined in a bunch of different ways, whether that's community control, which is what citizens are mobilizing for in education and in planning, or whether decentralization means bringing the government to a visible presence at a street and neighborhood level, which is what the Lindsay administration is trying to do. So not shown in this picture, but present via the model in Callender's hands, or maybe conspicuously absent, are the designers of this park. So here we have Paul Friedberg, a landscape architect who's really at the start of his career and one of very few landscape architects in the US who actually work in cities at the time. And next to him is Sonia Johansson, also a very young landscape architect who works in his office and who did all the work on this project, and will go on to be a noted playground designer in her own right. So Friedberg designed this Vest Pocket Park that we're looking at in Bedford-Stuyvesant just a couple of years earlier. And it was among the very first of these that were built in the city. In this case, he worked with the Pratt Institute and with a Central Brooklyn community organization on two sites that were purchased for a token fee from the city to turn them into playgrounds. And in these very first projects, he developed a pretty distinctive approach, creating parks that were open to the street and meant to be integrated with the city rather than set apart. He reused materials to create these miniature urban topographies of abstract geometric forms. And according to Friedberg, he assembled these and set them up by watching kids playing around on the site before it was finished and observing what they wanted to do and how they wanted to move through the landscape. And he called this his theory of linked play. And so creating these designs where children are free to chart their own movement is really a direct response to the more dictatorial playground layout and equipment of the mass recreation efforts of Robert Moses over the previous 30 years. Moses built playgrounds like this one in large numbers, but the feeling was that the kids who use them are just that, they're numbers. They're really seen as an undifferentiated mass that not only needs to be housed and fed, but also recreated in playgrounds like this one, where they wait their turn, for their turn to go up the slide and then down the slide and then back again, and repeat in this kind of empty formula. And in contrast, these new spaces that Friedberg designs are all about recognizing the humanity and creativity and agency of the kids who are using them. Then also amenities like the Moses playgrounds were also poorly distributed across the city and often bypassed neighborhoods with racialized populations. So this new Vest Pocket Park project is also a form of redress. Behind the project is the idea that the city is going to now be bringing the best designs to the places that have been the most overlooked. Okay, and so there's one more character present at this meeting and in this photograph, and it's actually 4 more people. On the far right, you see a cameraman, and next to him, a director. Behind Courtney Callender, you might be able to make out the mic of the sound recordist. And of course, in front of us or between them and us is the photographer that the Parks Department has sent in to take this picture. So it's really important to note that this meeting is being filmed. And they're making a documentary as part of the grant that's funding the project. The city got just under $500,000 from the also new Federal Department of Housing and Urban Development in this, which was its first urban beautification and improvement demonstration project. So we want to note here, the park is being built because of a new federal funding opportunity. And it's a demonstration. It's both an experiment and a showpiece. It's being made to be seen and to be disseminated far beyond the block scale that the park itself is supposed to be serving. And if you watch the film, which they completed and which is called A Park on My Block, you can see what actually happens at the meeting. And this meeting is kind of a mess. What happens is the residents bring up their concerns. They're worried about things like maintenance and security. And the women at the meeting ask about lighting. They say they would really like a fence to keep the park closed at night. And they press for assurances that the Parks Department is actually going to act on their feedback and desires. But meanwhile, Hector and Callender are really careful not to make any promises. And they suggest even at one point that putting up fences could just invite more temptation to vandalize the playground. We saw already the designers themselves aren't part of this conversation. And a reason that the administrators are hedging is that the things that the women are asking for go pretty fundamentally against Friedberg's design philosophy. This idea that the parks are an extension of the city, there's something that's open to the street and not a space apart. Although they did actually use shade structures and seating to protect the children playing inside from running out onto the street, right? They're not dumb. But this participatory design philosophy seems at the same time to preclude the community's actual participation in the making of the park. So the following year, this park is finished, and here you have it. The pipe and cable play equipment is one of 4 sets of modular play structures that Friedberg designed. They were supposed to be prototypes for rapid implementation, so that if folks in a neighborhood had a lot and they wanted to put up a playground, they could basically go grab this stuff and set it up, almost overnight. But to create a stronger demonstration in these first test cases meant that they actually used granite pavers and built up wooden topography, even though they didn't plant any trees anywhere at the different demonstration sites. And they also incorporated murals and sculpture by contemporary artists. And these are a few pictures of some of the other Vest Pocket parks actually taken by Sonia Johansson when she went to check them out at the time. So I really love that they're not the posed photographs of the Parks Department's archives or the kinds of things that you see published, but really sort of captured on the fly and in use. Now, by the end of the film A Park on My Block, the film closes with a few signs of trouble for this program. The camera catches trash everywhere in these parks. And at the end, Heckscher talks a little bit wistfully about what was learned in the process, especially that community participation all the way through from the beginning to the end is what is most important here. And we can learn, if we read it, from a subsequent report about all the bad feelings and maintenance issues that developed around what had been envisioned as a joint venture between residents and the Parks Department. Who was actually supposed to keep these things clean? How is the Parks Department, and others supposed to keep up with social conditions that are changing beyond the park's boundaries? So in this same period, and here's one of the Vest Pocket parks, a different one in 1972, the Parks Department budget goes down. There's not money for maintenance. Neighborhood conditions are getting worse. And all these Vest Pocket parks suffer from neglect and from vandalism. Some of the destruction is from overuse and some of it isn't. But by the early 70s, several of these are what's called surrendered by the Parks Department. That's their terminology, literally, for abandoning the park sites. Well, at the same time, and this picture is also taken in 1972, Paley Park, which is also part of the Vest Pocket Park construction wave of this period, and it's not just these 10 in this one, but many, many all over the city. But in this case, Paley, with a private endowment and a security guard in Midtown Manhattan, thrives and goes on to become a textbook example of urban public space when there start to be textbooks for that, which starts a little bit later in the 70s. So why do I tell this kind of awkward and convoluted story? It does a good job encapsulating the approach and the questions of the book as a whole, and sums up a great many of the aspirations, contradictions, and struggles of the period, and attempts by the city and designers to create more participatory and inclusive open spaces. So here you see in a nutshell how a liberal elite leadership and a new group of progressive designers and administrators who have good ideas and government funding and are propelled by demands from below to redress inequalities and exclusion from the public realm, they try to do things differently, both because they're trying to make a different city and also because they need to look like they're making a different city quite expediently so that there won't be more riots, all while the national political culture is shifting around them, and it's hard. So if the story is confusing and vexing, that's pretty central to the category that we call public space. And when designers and scholars and critics and most people talk about public space as such, we're always alighting normative theories of public spheres and public spaces that are open to all as equals and have some form of democratic control, with the actual physical spaces that never seem to measure up. And there's a reason why that happens. That was a big motivation for writing the book, understanding this never-ending confusion over and if you try to teach these things, how do you define public space? Is this space public? Is this space public? But is it really public? And the continual disappointment and hand-wringing with how actual spaces diverge from some very lofty ideals. And in the book, I argue that that disconnect or those contradictions are the result of a specific historical process. They come out of what actually happened when a city and a bunch of designers and administrators and others set out to create a more democratic city, and from what they thought they learned from that experience. So that's why I've been talking about a meeting instead of showing you a survey of all the cool plans and designs of the period, of which there are a lot. And I also want us to understand public space not as this ideal, but as a thing, literally the thing that Courtney Callender is holding in his hands, a thing that creates relations of citizenship. So not too long ago, the political theorist Bonnie Honig wrote about public things as concrete environments that interpolate us into democratic citizenship. And they do that not just by being there or by our being in them, but also in terms of how they're made and how they're interpreted. So a reasonable question that people usually ask about this project and about the book is how you can say public space was invented at this time, right? What about Central Park, or what about the Piazza San Marco in Venice? We call all those things public spaces, but actually no one called them public space until after this period in question. And there's a great dissertation from a while back by the planner Luc Nadal that demonstrates this quite clearly. So it's at this very specific moment in history that distinct things like streets and parks and plazas and waterfronts come together to be understood as public space. Something that I call in the book a designed environment with a socio-political function insecurely attached to it. So this is something that's being designed and defined experimentally at this specific point in time, and that's responding to a very 60s combination of concerns. On the one hand, about conformity and the threats of a mass society to individuality and to the future of democracy. And on the other, coming out of the civil rights movement and the social movements that follow, a reckoning with the exclusion that's inherent in the public spaces that do exist, that have really been designed and imagined for a homogeneous public. They're supposed to be for all, but they actually exclude vast segments of the population on account of race or ethnicity or age or gender or sexuality. And they make that exclusion visible too. So these two concerns together are motivating attempts by the professional shapers of the built environment to make urban spaces differently, to find ways to include specific and heterogeneous publics in these spaces and in the life of the city, and to make space for some degree of self-determination and individual development in those spaces. So there's one other important person in this story who isn't at the meeting, and that's the mayor at the time, John Lindsay, who was elected in 1965 to bring a fresh approach to a city in crisis. And here he is in the middle of a collage by Romer Bearden for a 1960 issue of Time magazine with the cover story, New York, Breakdown of a City. And it does a nice visual shorthand illustration of the urban crisis at this time. Obviously, a term that means a lot of things, different things to different people at different times. But here, what it looks like is a social and physical rupture in the city-people relationship. And you have in the collage the very young and diverse population of the city on top. We're demanding sort of full participation in the life of the city, and are threatening disorder and chaos and maybe even violence if they're not heeded. And you see that possibility in the two policemen kind of at opposite corners of the collage. And on the bottom, we see vacant residential buildings crumbling and maybe even on fire, and the skyscrapers of Manhattan jutting out at these anxious angles. Their survival here threatened by this accelerating movement of industry and corporate headquarters and white middle-class residents to suburbia's greener pastures. And so in the face of this crisis and a crisis of faith in the city's survival, and especially in its ability to serve as common ground for different people, Lindsay tries to make New York City a national model of an inclusive democracy. And for him, the city's open spaces in particular are what's going to glue back this urban and social fabric that here literally is being torn apart. So new or reused public spaces can show that the city is for the people who have been excluded from the public realm in the past. And at the same time, public spaces can demonstrate the value of urban life and contribute to an argument that the city is diverse, inclusive, and also fun and appealing. And Lindsay employed a special brand of spatial politics that was particularly attuned to the power of design and also highly performative. So we did things like walk the streets of Harlem and Bedford-Stuyvesant, not just after the assassination of Martin Luther King in this photograph, but as a regular practice. And he'd show up to inaugurate West Pocket Park after West Pocket Park. And he bikes in Central Park, which is newly closed off to cars and activated by happenings like this one. This is called an event called Build Your Own Castle and Blank in It. That was one of many happenings held in the park starting in 1966. And the message behind an event like this one here is that everyone's participating in this collective enterprise that at the same time is oriented towards individual creativity and self-discovery, but it's a sign that the city's giving people control over their environment, if only in a limited way. So New York City's open spaces become this fertile terrain for experimentation in the period, both in the countercultural sense of making room for activities that are free of predicted outcomes. And in other cases, as we'll see, also because these projects are being watched for results from which to draw conclusions. And one other thing that's important to note about that is that if New York City does provide this experimental terrain, many of the designs and the strategies that are employed there develop and come from elsewhere. But what they achieve in the city is a critical mass and a high degree of visibility, thanks to Lindsay's spatial politics and also to the city's status as a global media center. And I want to talk a little bit about just a couple of other experiments from the book. One of them, the one that inaugurates this this period, in fact, dates to before Lindsay's election as mayor, and it's also a project by Paul Friedberg, who was commissioned in 1965 to redesign the open space at a public housing complex. These are the Jacob Riis houses, also on the Lower East Side. And what we can see at the Jacob Riis houses is how the functionalist landscapes of urban renewal were falling short. So here there's plenty of open space that is there to let in light and air, and it serves these abstract principles. It brings in light and air, but where do people fit in, and where are kids supposed to play? In the photograph, you can see them sort of scurrying around the edges, and all the green space is fenced in. Often there are signs that say "keep off." And at the Riis houses and many other developments like them, there's actually constant conflict around the use of these open spaces, trying to keep kids and residents off. And it worked as a sort of proxy battle about the status of residents in the housing and in the city as a whole. Not having free movement and use of this space is representative of a status more as dominated subject than as full citizen. So a very thoughtful administrator for the New York City Housing Authority, Ira Robbins, got philanthropic money to redo first another open space in this, and then this one. And had Friedberg, with a much bigger budget than in those first West Pocket Parks that you saw, create a new urban landscape focused on use. So he transformed the undifferentiated open space of the Riis houses into 4 distinct outdoor rooms that you can see here. And the most notable among them are an amphitheater that's going to be used for community gatherings and for cultural events, and that actually doubles as a spray pool in summer. And then an adventure playground at the north end of the plaza. So this is a more fully realized version of what you saw in the West Pocket Parks that really creates this urban microcosm. It serves as an environment for children's free movement and sort of by extension from that, their development as creative individuals. It's a space that's sort of oriented towards their self-actualization in the language of the day. And the reception of this project is a really big deal. In the New York Times, for example, Ada Louise Huxtable writes that the project at Riis points to, quote, the solution by design of some of the American city's more pressing social problems. Thomas Hoving, Lindsay's first parks commissioner, uses Reese Plaza for a photo op for a feature in Life magazine, among other places. And the plaza meets with such success on the ground in terms of the kind of use that it gets, not just by residents, but also from folks who live outside of the Jacob Riis houses, that a couple of years later, the associated architects for this project write, seeing if it's possible to put a public bathroom in the plaza, saying, quote, "It's become a real public space." And the plaza has a material influence on city policy. Hoving puts new adventure playgrounds in Central Park, as well as elsewhere in the city. On the left is the sort of first and most notable one by Richard Datner. The city's Housing and Development Administration commissions a study to revisit the plazas and open space of a series of urban renewal projects, specifically stressing that they want to follow the lead of Riis. And so this is a project from that report by Lawrence Halprin in the middle. You saw some of the Vest Pocket parks, of which that HUD program is just one example, another residential plaza. And the model really extends across the city, even to environments that are conceived on a regional scale. So here we have Friedberg's playground and amphitheater combined in the form of a pool for adults at Harlem River State Park in the Bronx, which is now Roberto Clemente State Park. And this was actually the first state park in New York City, inaugurated in 1973, and part of a whole new category of regional scale parks on deindustrialized waterfronts in the city. Those waterfronts being another kind of space in transition in this period. And so here and at other projects like it, there's a push to remediate environmental conditions that gets combined with an attempt to remediate inequality in access to natural recreation, part of the social project of the Parks to People movement at this time. So in this case, Harlem River State Park is really envisioned as a new city that follows the Harlem River and also the railroad and the highway that are right next to it. These are some of those infrastructures are helping to propel people out of the Bronx into the suburbs at the time. But in this design, counteracting that movement, especially of white residents out of the city, the open space is meant to be a vehicle for integration. So this linear park is conceived as a kind of connective tissue that's going to seed community facilities and new racially integrated housing and create a sense of belonging across different neighborhoods as each of these share resources across local political boundaries. So the idea is the park has 4 nodes, each one has different facilities that then can get shared across all of the neighborhoods that connect to each other through the park. In fact, only one node was completed. So all of these open space experiments are notable for their focus on the urban periphery, their explicit inclusion of marginalized publics, and attempts to redistribute access to open space, as well as putting a focus on use and individual experience. So a good question to ask at this point is, well, what about the center of the city? This period's really better known for things like the work of the Urban Design Group and things like incentive zoning in Midtown and downtown planning, bonus plazas and arcades. And I want to finish with a little bit of a different perspective on that, talking about some experiments to pedestrianize Midtown Manhattan in the early 1970s. And these experiments are both divergent from and central to the connections that are being forged in this period between urban open spaces and definitions of citizenship. So Concerns with the state of the public realm in this period weren't limited to conditions in the inner city. Midtown streets, too, were seen as alienating and undignified. They were congested, superannuated, overmotorized, and afforded neither the urbane pleasures of sidewalk dining and convivial strolling, nor the sterile ease of access of the suburban mall or office park. And planners in New York City were really concerned with the pleasantness of the pedestrian environment, especially as they were developing plans to shore up the city's status as a national center for corporate headquarters and cultural institutions. And this pedestrian street and open space plan is from a study of movement in Midtown done by Van Ginkel Associates for the Office of Midtown Planning and Development. Now, on the first Earth Day in April of 1970, the city closed a huge chunk of Fifth Avenue to car traffic. It was a mass environmental protest, but it was also a test of the feasibility of plans in the works to close parts of this area to traffic. And the results on Earth Day were so widely praised that Lindsay declared a bunch of temporary street closings that summer and fall on Fifth Avenue and on Madison Avenue. And a very interesting thing that happens in this experiment in returning streets to the people, as it's described in the press, is that it's not just a really big hit, but it inspires dozens of participants to voluntarily report on their experiences in the form of letters, so many letters that they send to Mayor Lindsay to talk about how they felt being in these street closures. Letters like this one from Stephanie Adegi, who signs it as citizen and writes, "Power to the pedestrian." People write and describe their experiences being out in the street, using terms of citizenship and talking about alienation and civility and describing exchanges of views and interaction among people of different walks of life as this kind of model public sphere. And they talk about this stuff this way because the kinds of things that they've been seeing on the street, and this is a scene from a March for Women's Equality that takes place just days after Earth Day on Fifth Avenue, same place, different march, means that the folks are seeing the street really in connection to the expansion and experience of citizenship. But while these pedestrians are volunteering their experiences of these new conditions of belonging and being together, there's another kind of experiment that's going on at the same time. Planners and social scientists are studying the exact same places and the exact same street closures, but they're doing things like measuring air quality, doing traffic counts, and crowding studies. And this other set of eyes on the street includes people like the beloved urbanist William H. White, and also the social psychologist Stanley Milgram. Milgram, his offices overlook 42nd and 5th, and he's running literal experiments on social behavior in conditions of density and heterogeneity, using New York City as his lab. They're really interested in these questions about how does civility break down when people live together in close quarters. This is the time of concepts like the behavioral sink, right? And the mice who, if you, crowd too many of them in an experimental maze, start exhibiting pathological behavior. And so Milgram's graduate students do this really incredible study at the time that subsequently gets cited and taken up in all the planners' reports for pedestrianization. What the students are doing is intentionally bumping into people on the street while somebody watches from above, not that far above, to see what'll happen. And they embed in a footnote of this study a really fascinating and very telling aspect of the work. They report on the fact that they only experimented on white subjects, because when they started the study, they found that when they did this experiment and they didn't yield to Black people on the street, things got heated. So their way of dealing with that was just removing them from the study, basically black boxing the actual political conditions of sharing the street, to draw what they take as universal conclusions about pedestrian behavior. So this work, meaning work that White does, that Milgram does, that the Regional Plan Association and the city are doing at this time, is all in the service of planning for the happiness of this critical figure of the pedestrian. And this pedestrian is rather different from a citizen, as Milgram's student study that I just described hopefully begins to indicate. All experiences of being in public are not the same. And the pedestrian is much more likely to be a commuter or a tourist living outside the city altogether than a resident. And that's because plans for pedestrianization are connected to reinforcing Midtown as this national center. And its offices for white-collar workers who increasingly live outside the city and commute into work are going to expand into spaces that up until now are allocated for manufacturing jobs. So the jobs that employ the people who aren't leaving the city, the ones for whom most of the other public spaces that we've been looking at are being designed. And yet the proposals for this kind of pedestrianization thrive on a rhetoric of inclusion. This is a project by Ulrich Franzen from the period for the Upper East Side of Manhattan that he describes as, quote, liberating the street for the collective use of the people. A pedestrian mall on Madison Avenue that was going to be Lindsay's legacy didn't pan out, but the city planning department continued to vaunt new streets for people and more enjoyable public space as they implemented subsequent malls. So it becomes possible through a kind of superimposition of associations for something that's actually not very inclusive or redistributive to be seen as a specifically public space that's radical or almost revolutionary. So around this time, around 1974 and forever after, we can sort of see this phenomenon: public space is dead, long live public space. It's a contradiction that's no less familiar today as we find ourselves at another point of inflection when it comes to the future of the city and its public realm and who and what it's for. So the ideas and associations behind the public spaces that I've just kind of breezed through endure and thrive, but a lot of the subsequent spaces that have benefited from those associations and have developed into a pretty orthodox international formula for how you generate public life have done so without necessarily making good on the expansion of publics and their participation in urban life as is associated with them. So I know this isn't the sort of simplest argument, and it works best in the aggregate through a variety of the sort of experiences and cases in the book. So I hope you'll read it. But either way, at least I think take away this. The first thing being that urban public space as a specific thing that's connected to ideas both of an inclusive urban democracy and to a certain degree of individual delight is a historical product, and it's not necessarily an unmitigated good. It's not an ideal thing, but it's a contradictory thing. And second, when you think public space, think publics plural, how they're included and also how they're elided. At its best, public space can materially and symbolically make way for inclusion of more people in the life of the city and, more importantly, in its making. But you have to try really hard. It's continuous work, and it can't transcend fundamental social conditions, even as it can open new avenues forward. And so I think with that, before I'll let us kind of get into conversation and turn it back to Carol. I'll also just share while my slides are up for folks here a code for ordering the book directly from Minnesota Press. They have like an enormous 40% discount. So you have that on the screen there, and we can share it in the chat. But I will turn my screen off.
Great, thank you, Mariana. That was really a fantastic presentation, and it was a real blast from the past as well to see the congregating crowds in the 70s, how startling it is to our present moment to see everyone crowded together, even if it's with a zoom lens on Fifth Avenue. But nevertheless, to remember how both active and activist those crowds were. It wasn't just protesters. It was, as you say, citizens kind of coming out to endorse the idea of open streets and celebrating the city. Now, are David Smiley and James Sanders with us? And can you turn your cameras on and bring you onto the screen? Hey, there's David and there's James. I don't know if you guys heard me introduce you at the very beginning, but that's already been done. And so what I'm going to do is to invite you immediately to begin to comment. And why don't we start with James, since your focus on Lindsay and Fun City and the city itself as a stage seems so pertinent to everything that Mariana was exposing.
Thank you, Carol, and thanks to Mariana for that wonderful presentation. It was like as you say, a walk down memory lane. I'm of an age where my very start as a teenager was exactly in this world, such that I, first of all, remembered, all those events and those playgrounds being the new and most exciting thing, meeting with the folks at the Office of Lower Manhattan and Midtown Planning and Development that were created in the Lindsay era. And indeed, the very first piece of serious work I ever did as an undergraduate was an analysis of the Madison Avenue Mall, which was the major outgrowth of the Van Ginkel scheme. So it's just fantastic, and it's so beautiful to see all the gathering of the materials that Mariana has put together, because I know some of them, but it's wonderful to see them. It was an extraordinary time, and Mariana talked about, and I think evoked, some of the contradictions of the era. It was, on the one hand, an incredibly liberating moment. John Lindsay was this unique figure who got elected in late 1965. He was unlike any mayor who had been before him ever, really, in New York history. And tall, patrician, from the 17th Congressional District, the so-called Silk Stocking District, but incredibly excited about what we would now call innovation, and getting bright people into the city government, particularly young, bright people, to shake things up and to do things in a different way. And it's really important, and I think Mariana evoked this, but I would emphasize how important it is to understand how heavy the hand of Robert Moses had been. Robert Moses had not been the Parks Commissioner technically since 1960. And he was, by 1967 and 68, already had lost most of his actual official positions. But his approach to civic improvement had been so broad, it had covered both the city and the state. It had been in force for 4 decades, for people's entire lives. People had grown up with those playgrounds and those parks. And in the latter part of his career, yes, they had become incredibly formulaic. They were very well made. They were responsive. They were old-fashioned and conservative, insofar as they did respond to the kinds of things that the community was concerned with, like they had fences, they could be closed, they were well maintained in their day. And by the way, as a little kid growing up in them, I loved them. They were perfectly fine. They didn't look as grim as the photographs that Mariana showed. They were in good weather, lovely and green and well made and so forth. But they were certainly not imaginative or inventive or forward thinking. And here Lindsay comes in on a whole raft of fronts with these bright young architects and designers and urban planners coming up with all these fresh new ideas. And it was a thrilling moment. On the other hand, and this is a little not so clear, I think, looking back historically, because time tends to compress, but there was a huge difference between New York of 1966, when John Lindsay took office, and New York of 1973 when he left office. that was in retrospect telescoped. It looks like the same period. It was not. There was a kind of an optimism and an anything goes and all things are possible. New York was the richest and most, the commercial base of New York was thriving. Even though it had problems, they seemed manageable in 1966. By 1973, that's not true at all anymore. The city really now feels inundated by trouble. The trouble has risen from just sort of here and there to sort of take over the whole city. And the mood is decidedly grimmer. And also there have been a lot of national events that have occurred in the meantime. But I think that's important to see, because it felt to some degree like all this thrilling, exciting new things were happening in these sort of particular spheres, and then the world was crashing down around them. The city was getting more dangerous by the year. Those wonderful parks, the concerns of the Puerto Rican community people were very real. They didn't see these lovely places as wonderful places where kids would be playing optimistically in utopian fashion. They saw them at night as places where, bad people would hang out and do bad things in their view. So I think that's an important arc to understand the sort of change of the city. Another aspect, and I'll just finish here, I'm sure David would like to jump in. There was a kind of, in retrospect, charming optimism about community participation. I hate to sound like a old-time conservative, but there was a fundamental issue, which Robert Caro points out in The Power Broker, which is that autocratic type of government, gets things done, and to expect community boards and community groups to actually create things, well, it's a nice idea, but in the sort of microcosmic story that Mariana tells became the story of New York of the next 4 decades. Community groups are good at saying no. They're not good at saying yes. They're not good, certainly, at creating new things and inventing new things. And it's a fairly short arc from that community board meeting to the Maisel brothers film about the gates, where here Christo comes and Jean-Claude come and they say, we're going to do this amazing thing in Central Park. It's 1979. They say, oh, it's going to be incredible. It'll only last 2 weeks. We'll take everything out. It'll be fine. We'll pay for the whole thing. And the community board people are like, are you crazy? This is a desecration of our historic park. You can never do this. They're so tight in their negativity that they can't, this lovely couple comes to them with this wonderful idea and they have no response to it except to say no. And it took decades and decades later till someone came along, Michael Bloomberg, and said, hey, this is not a bad idea. Why don't we try doing it? So it doesn't mean community boards are bad or that they don't have a role, but I think those tensions have to be shown in play. And the last thing I'll say is that was the worst model I've ever seen in my life. The model the man is holding, which has the tiny little park between the 2 buildings, which all you can see are the 2 tenements and you can't see the park. If I were going to try to sell a park, I would build the model slightly differently, and I'll end there.
Shall I kind of give us our ground rules as it's 7 o'clock, and maybe we'll go to 7:15 about. Mariana, maybe rather than give you a chance to respond to that, we'll ask David to give us his reactions. And I'll just mention again that it seems so germane to me and in a kind of parallel universe that David's writing on many of the same designers operating in the suburbs, creating a public space in a privatized world and in an almost entirely white world is an interesting counterpart to Marianne's talk. And James.
I'm moving.
Okay.
To keep things quiet.
David, take it away, although Mr. Film has gotten our attention.
I'm sorry, were you asking my question? Me a question?
No, David's
David,
supposed to speak.
yeah.
Just want to say thank you, Carol, and thank you, Mariana and James. Mariana, your work is fantastic, and I'm thrilled that you were able in 30 or 40 minutes to really show an incredible kind of overlapping set of conflicting threads that take shape around this notion of public. And unfortunately, we have to just assume that word is in quotes, and we'll just leave it at that. The kind of, on the one hand, the optimism, as James said, but also the shift in the period where optimism was highly curtailed. But so I want to make a few kind of comments about the period that I think you demonstrate really well. One has to do with, and you captured it really well in your discussion of August Heckscher, the kind of patrician attitude, which Lindsay also had, which is, I think what we're seeing here is the kind of, the overarching problem here is liberalism and the collapse of liberalism, which for all its good intents was always blinkered, was always kind of hindered by its prejudices. And you mentioned this very clearly, with community participation being a problem, with race being a problem, especially. And I would say that we have learned a lot from that period's failures. And I'm not sure community participation is we're done with it yet. I would say probably we're only just starting to get it right, James. I would just sort of like to throw that out for a future discussion. But I think in the period we're seeing an incredible, really good guys, mostly good white guys, really trying to kind of hold the banner of this long tradition of progressivism, of which Moses early in his career could have seen as an example.
Yes.
Really coming up against like people and organizations saying, no, thank you, or what can we do? And so at the same time that New York is being underinvested and the whites are fleeing, there's a kind of new opportunity for engagement among people who hadn't been asked before. So you could say that what we're seeing is just a trauma of social change. So James, you say from 66 to 73, that's exactly the kind of collapse of the economy, not just in New York, but in a sense, the collapse of the liberal Keynesian model of spending, which New York was very good at, which could not be sustained. And so after the 70s, New York reinvented the austerity budget, and New York reinvented the kind of pull away of social spending, which actually Reagan learned from, as well as corporations. So this is an incredible moment, I would say, when the what is hitting the fan in public spending and in public works, and a concept of the state as a steward of public life just collapsing. And yet we have some of my favorite projects of all time on Madison Avenue they were my favorite projects because they're just so crazy. They're just so optimistic, even as their audience is so limited, it's so narrow. I mean, the Franzen or the Madison Avenue stuff, the Van Ginkel stuff, it's, as you say, it's like for the white business center to draw back suburbanites, to draw back the people who I like to study in the suburbs, they're men when they're coming into work, or tourists. I mean, that little bubble, and those are the best drawings ever, and they look a lot like suburban mall renderings of the same period. And so what's great is that there's a kind of similarity of essentially a presumption of a white middle class audience in both places. The suburban malls in the 70s and the New York City in the mid 70s were essentially competing for the same dollars, the same spenders. Although and so they're I could plop a roof over any of those and be out on Long Island or out in Westchester or wherever. And so I'm mostly therefore interested in the even more problematic framing of public when you start talking about malls, because clearly they're not. They never were, and the developers never really wanted them to be, except in the most superficial of ways. And I think what happens in the city, though, is there's a kind of the chance, or the optimism was that they wouldn't be quite like those commercialized malls. And the difference was that this is not just about commerce, it's about some kind of different public life. And that's where the city projects, at least in this period, I think are the most endearing to me, which is they really are maybe a liberalist dream, but still seeking some kind of complexity, some kind of urbanity. And urbanity is a great word that's used by suburban developers of malls, that they're seeking urbanity when it's just obviously sequestered and gated. And so I really appreciate the kind of the tensions that you're handling in this presentation and in your book, which is that the larger question of defining public is a constant. It's a constant thread, and this particular debate of liberalism's attempt to continue that discussion in the 60s and 70s is really instructive for us to since then, because it's evolving, and the question of who gets to speak, how people are included or not included, what kinds of designs are possible in this new complex sphere. So I don't know. I enjoyed also very simply the way you've woven together a lot of these very disparate threads into a story about what I consider to be a story of the kind of the kind of paradoxes of liberalism at a moment when it was at its most ambitious and yet about to collapse. So there's so many great bits and pieces that I'm sure that I'll find your footnotes and follow up on them. And I do have one detailed question, which is, what was Paul Friedberg reading? Yeah, what was he looking at? Was he looking at Aldo van Eyck? I'm just curious about his education, but you could email me. It's okay.
I mean, I can email you and tell you some of that. One of the things that really early on for me was super interesting was, at some point when we started talking about this stuff, and describing this period that, gets sort of written off as like, oh, well, we had all these good ideas, but like nothing worked. And I think I do want to trouble that sort of assessment of failure and the sort of brackets on this period and sort of way we close that experiment. But I mean, this is really random, but only because you asked. One of the first things that actually came up in discussions were Milgram's obedience to authority experiments as somehow sort of explaining, what is motivating some of the work in this period, and this this really, particular sort of definition or placement of the future of democracy in the individual's capacity to be free and original and insubordinate, that actually is so much underlying. I mean, there's a whole current of how the psychological thinking of the day is not just informing the work, but informing very strongly how people are making sense of what happens with some of these experiments. And that thinking, James, also changes very quickly in this period as these things are going on. That's a really powerful current here. But I think one thing that makes it difficult to look at, and I think clouds some of the lessons that are drawn, is that it is an incredibly short and compressed period where so much is happening, and things start out looking one way, just in terms of these sorts of questions of what kind of money is available for this, and what is it that we're actually trying to achieve and looking for. And in a very, very short span, it starts looking completely different. But I think one of the things that happens, and I'm not saying this, and I didn't write this as a kind of, neither an apology nor, obviously an uncritical celebration, but as the goalposts are sort of moving, one of the things in the shorter term that certainly happened and is maybe less drawn out in the talk are these kinds of substitutions of, oh, well, we thought this was good, but now we definitely know it's bad, right? Like participation doesn't work. Fences are really important all the time because otherwise, people are going to break in. And a lot of that stuff that sort of gets taken as, okay, it's very clear based on what happened in this case that, like these are the best practices and this failed, are also informed by incredibly particular and historically and socially specific circumstances that end up, becoming part of practices that then get applied, all over the place. And for the next 50 years sort of taken as like, well, we know how to do public space now, right? Like these are the rules, let's do it here, let's do it there. So there's both a kind of weird idea that, oh, that didn't work because it didn't, there's a kind of gravity of experimental value that's brought to work that's ultimately quite anecdotal, that's carried on to sort of explain what may or may not be possible in ways that in some ways, I think, David, what you're saying is absolutely right. Some of this stuff, however much later, it's either repeating the same mistakes or maybe just starting to sort of understand, oh, this is maybe how to do it. Let's not do the same thing over and over again. That a lot of some of the insights actually that come through, the trying and either trying and failing or trying and seeing in this period get a little bit lost in the way experiments are interpreted based on what the world looks like in 1973, which is really different from what it looks like in 1966.
Well, since we have maybe 5 minutes to kind of wrap up with a kind of rethoughts of conclusions, maybe we can go around to James and David again, because James, it seemed to me that what I was hearing you say in terms of assessing the period is that you fall onto the favor of the innovation, the creativity, the spark that seemed to exist in the period, and think that maybe the legacy of that hasn't carried forward with the same success. And it sounds to me that David is a little more suspicious throughout of the assessing the success of the period, and perhaps more appreciative of the politics that continue to evolve. So am I misreading what you're saying, or would you like to quite simply and briefly summarize?
Very well said. No, I'm sensitive to the politics, and in fact, I would bring up that this was all politically driven. To some degree, Lindsay was playing to his base, which was Upper West Side liberals and African-American and Latino families. And one of the things that brought him down was he didn't care much at all about what would just right after be thought of as sort of Archie Bunker land, which is Brooklyn and Queens and Staten Island and the Northern Bronx and other parts of Manhattan, which were not happy at all about the focus he was making. But I will go flip that around and say, sort of restate the thesis of the article I wrote, which was, to me, all of this is about a crucial sea change in our feeling about cities. That in the Lindsay administration, an idea emerged that cities could be fun, and it was easily mocked and all of that. But the idea that people would live in cities not because they were sort of economically and commercially the best place to live and most sort of economically productive place to live, but otherwise were pretty gray and boring, but rather that they were the most fun and exciting places you could live. Well, that idea, although it took many years and decades, in fact, animates the world we live in today, in which a whole cohort, and has been now for 20 or 30 years, a cohort of young people have decided that given anywhere that they can live, they want to live in cities and enjoy exactly the kind of life, let's call it the Jane Jacobs, urbane lifestyle that was the province of this kind of group of innovative, imaginative people back in the day. So in that sense, it was a profound change. We do not live in the city of Robert Wagner, but we do live in the city in some degree of John Lindsay. So, you know, that held on. That became the massive change. The city is a place of joy. The city of a place of fun. That was the thing they brought, the excitement and the energy they brought that through. It took, you know, went to sleep for about 20 years because of the crime, but it kind of came back with an incredible vengeance, and the movies and all of that were part of it.
Well, I think of myself as a realist, but I do appreciate the useful kind of dialogue about perceptions of New York City or cities in general. To use the language of the city of fun, I think I would raise one point, which is the other person who said that is James Rouse. And I'm not sure that his model of cities being fun is equitable and sustainable. I'm not against cities being fun, but I'm also, I think there's a social cost that is not distributed equally in such a model. The second thing I would say is that cities were fun, that you know, we have Lindsay to Bloomberg, but in between we have Giuliani and the violence of street policing and the kind of extreme supervision and control. So I think both of those are operating. I think that it's a kind of I'm not usually, it's a kind of binary that in some ways, some of the kind of fun and entertainment that we whoever we are appreciating also required a certain level of pressure, to use a polite word. So you know, I think that's why the period is so fascinating, because there was it really was the kind of emergence of the city as having other values, but they were not yet shared values, and I think they were trying to be. And as we come back to this kind of liberal conundrum, so and I mean, I think we're always going to be kind of having that tussle with the driver of cities and the you know, the kinds of ways in which cities can become both fun and productive for more and more of its citizenry. I'm teaching a class now, and we're on actually public space and et cetera. And my students will be very happy that I brought this up. There's a term called Cappuccino Urbanism that some of you may have heard of, which is what I worry about with cities that are too concerned with the social life of a certain sector of their population, rather than a wider social sharing of social benefits. I have benefited greatly from living in the city in the past 40 years and followed that trajectory. But I think, I don't know what the future is, when in fact we have, because of the racial kind of awakening of the past several years, we may actually finally get to some participation that is worth the name. Unfortunately, it had to come at great cost, but maybe it'll actually produce something new, something different, something widely shared.
Rather than call on Mariana to solve this problem, I will mediate the evening by thanking her and both David and James very much for raising all of these issues again. And I think the best way to mediate this is to think that we all dearly hope that New York will return to be a fun city, and that we will sit together in the same room and do the usual at the Skyscraper Museum, would be to have a wine reception after a delightful talk, and to enjoy the social space of real space rather than virtual. But we're really delighted that, Mariana, you could bring us all together tonight and show us this rich array of subjects of politics and optimism. And I will encourage everybody to buy your book, especially at 40% off, and to use that. We can send around a notice in our Eventbrite, to thanking people for this evening to alert you of how to find a book, because as you can see, you will be richly rewarded if you dive further into the fun city that was New York in the 60s and maybe the early 70s, and we hope will return again by the end of 2021. So thank you guys for this evening and a really terrific talk, and see you all next time, folks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Carol.
Hello, everybody. Welcome. It's 6 o'clock, and it's time to begin the March book talk of our monthly series. And if you're new to this series, I invite you to look on our website to see the exciting range of upcoming events, and also to make sure that you're aware of a lecture series that is every Tuesday night, which is the Worldview Designing Global Super Talks. The architects have all spoken, and from the second half of the series, engineers are going to focus on kind of introduction and overview to the 21st century typology of super talls. Our book talks, however, has been a long-standing tradition of the Skyscraper Museum. We do them monthly. We invite authors to the gallery, and indeed, I'm here in the empty gallery. And our author for this evening, as you all know, is Mariana Mogilevich, who is the author of a relatively new book. It had a covert pub date in the end of the summer, but this in fact is her first opportunity to talk about the book to a large audience. And indeed, the audience should exceed, if you all come from your RSVPs, the capacity of our Zoom calls. So you should know that people can join us in a live stream on YouTube, but also catch up with the video once it's fully edited and added both to our website and to our YouTube channel. So all of our past talks and eventually all of our talks will be included on videos and in the permanent archive. So tonight, Mariana is going to talk about the invention of public space, designing for inclusion in Lindsay's New York. And before I introduce her a little more fully, I want to mention that we have surprise guests as discussants after the presentation by Mariana, and we'll be joined by, and I'm going to show you the images of the reason why our two additional speakers or discussants for a discussion on the meat of the moment in Mariana's talk will be joined by James Sanders, who wrote this really excellent article that I can recommend to you all from places and find on the web, as you see from this page. James is a board member of the Skyscraper Museum. He's an architect and an author. Many of you probably know his book, Celluloid Skyline, and Film in the City, if I have the title correctly. Two books that look at New York in film historically, but also in particular in a deep dive into Lindsay's New York. And so I thought it would be interesting to have James join us to extend the discussion of the politics and the era of Lindsay's urbanism, from the public spaces to the public sphere that is New York as a stage, as a set that was expanded by Lindsay specifically in these years. And then in addition, joining us is David Smiley, who is an architect and a historian and instructor at Columbia's GSAP, where he's the assistant director of the urban design program. And he's also the author of Pedestrian Modern, so shopping and American architecture, in the period just before Mariana is looking at New York. But I thought it would be interesting to kind of expand the discussion horizontally to the suburbs, but to focus it, as David does, in malls, where many of the same architects that worked in New York in the kind of redesign of urban spaces and indeed the invention of public space in the 70s had a kind of parallel universe that they were inventing in the suburbs. So with those two very capable discussants, we want to leave as much time as possible. And Mariana will speak for probably about 40 minutes, and then we'll have a discussion that may extend a few minutes after 7 o'clock. So Mariana is currently the editor-in-chief of Urban Omnibus. I'm sure that many of you read and are aware of that work, and she's the kind of woman behind the organization and the editing and the editorial decisions about the spectrum of topics, of urban topics that are covered in that online publication, which is presented and hosted by the Architectural League. Mariana did her dissertation on this topic of the invention of public space at Harvard at GSAPP, where she completed her PhD in 2012. And she's been at Urban Omnibus since 2016. She also teaches and has taught in a variety of universities around and keeps busy on many projects. So I am going to ask Mariana to turn her camera on and come onto the screen as I depart, and she'll then show her slides. But I will, before I leave, tell you that if you have questions that occur to you during her talk or anytime during the discussion, you can add them to the chat feature, and I will try to read and shape and moderate those questions into and introduce them into the discussion. So having already introduced all of the participants in the later discussion, I'm going to let Mariana take over, and then we'll all return after she finishes her presentation.